Hello and welcome everyone for joining us tonight. We appreciate all of you joining us here and online this evening. I'm Clay Pope. I'm the chairman of the Rural and Small Towns Table of Common Interest organization here in the state of Oklahoma. And we appreciate all of you joining for this, the second of our informational forums that we've done. Tonight our topic will be about broadband connectivity and the importance of broadband to rural Oklahoma. We have several guests with us this evening that will be making presentations to talk about this critical issue. But to start us off tonight, our first speaker is going to be our chairman emeritus of our organization, the Honorable David Walters, who's former governor of the state of Oklahoma, a leader in this issue at his time as the chief executive of the state, and then also his work that he's done once he's left office. And with that, I'm looking at our IT man. Governor Walters will be joining us virtually. Are we ready to go ahead? I'm going to turn it over to Governor Walters to make his presentation now online if he's ready.
Clay, I'm thinking I'm on. I hope you can see me on the screen. But let me just say how much I appreciate the Oklahoma Rural and Small Town Table of Common Interest for hosting this event on broadband connectivity in rural Oklahoma. Believe it or not, it's been an issue near and dear to my heart for many, many decades. And I will just say, for those of you who don't recall, I grew up on a dirt road outside of Canute, Oklahoma. Halfway between Elk City and Clinton. And I took some advanced placement classes at Southwestern Oklahoma State University. And so I really appreciate the university there hosting this event. This small town table of common interest is having some impact, Clay. I hope you noticed that the governor has sent a letter to the Attorney General that raises the point of monopoly interest in meat processing, which is so damaging the pricing for our ranchers and farmers in Oklahoma, which was exactly the topic that the Rural and Small Town Table of Common Interest took up last fall. So you guys are on the leading edge of raising these very important points. Now, there's a point that not many people think about unless you're a rancher or farmer who's really taking it in the shorts with this monopoly pricing that's going on. I'm just sorry that the governor and the legislature took so long to bring it to everyone's attention, at least certainly in this new administration. But I think the new administration already knew about these monopolistic practices. I'll just say that when I was governor 30 years ago, rural connectivity was a big deal then, and it's much bigger now. If you just think about it, I'm sure you're going to hear some excellent presentations tonight. The impact of this on education and healthcare and business, entertainment, and TV, as simple as that is, any cloud-based controls for sophisticated farming and ranching and manufacturing operations. And for 2 years, I know the legislature and the governor have been fighting over a plan to increase the availability of broadband internet service in rural areas and underserved urban areas. And so last week, finally, as I'm sure your speakers will comment on, and you may already be aware, they passed a bill which included $42 million in tax incentives for providers. It's a refundable sales and use tax rebate thing on broadband equipment for projects. It's capped at $20 million. 3/4 of the money is directed to rural areas. Now, I don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth, but 30 years ago, 3 decades ago, when I was trying to help build out a network across the state to connect our universities to the very beginning of the digital world, it was called OneNet at the time, and it became the backbone for our digital communications in Oklahoma. But 30 years ago, we stuck $25 million in a $300 million bond issue that we got funded by talking the tribes in lieu of taxes on their smoke shops to paying some funding to the state. And we used that money to float this bond issue and put $25 million 30 years ago into rural connectivity. So forgive me if I'm not impressed by a $20 million capped tax incentive. So much more needs to be done. The Tulsa World wrote a brilliant editorial. I hope others will comment on it tonight as well. Just 2 days ago, they said, quote, "In the modern world, broadband internet service isn't a luxury, it's an economic necessity. No part of the state can grow and thrive without it." One of the lessons that we all learned, Clay's kids experienced, everybody in rural Oklahoma and underserved areas in urban areas during this pandemic, is that we learned that solid internet service is also essential to public education. And much of Oklahoma doesn't have the service it needs at any price. The Kansas branch of the Federal Reserve Bank, for example, in July of 2019, identified that Oklahoma is ranked 47th nationally for rural access to broadband. Now, it always strikes me, I always like this effort by politicians to say, we're going to get in the top 10, we're going to get in the top 10. I think it's important, if you're going to try to get in the top 10, that you get out of the bottom 10. And so maybe we need to figure out how to get out of the bottom 10 in terms of rural access to broadband. A 2017 report by Oklahoma State University found approximately 30% of Oklahoma households had no type of internet connection at home. Now, I could name a string of countries that would embarrass you that have better numbers than that. I do international power business all over the world, and we pay attention to what their connectivity rates are as we enter these different countries. The state's digital divide has the makings of future economic failure. 72% of urban households connected to broadband, but only 48% of rural households. Oklahoma's surrounding states have moved more aggressively in recent years to narrow this digital divide. As a state, we can either catch up or give up. The proposed $42 million investment won't solve the problem. We have some hope because there's the new infrastructure package that hopefully is going to get passed, includes $100 billion to get all Americans connected over the next 8 years. And a significant chunk of that will go to rural broadband build-outs. And so I want to congratulate the Republican legislators, Logan Phillips out of Mounds, and the chair of the House Technology Committee, and Speaker Charles McCall. They've been championing this for a couple of years. But as rural electrification lifted Oklahoma families, this is another quote from the Tulsa World, as rural electrification lifted Oklahoma families from poverty in the 20th century, rural broadband can protect its future prosperity in the 21st century. It's an investment we can't afford not to make. And so thank you for dialing in tonight, for participating, for being there to talk about this very important issue. I hope this discussion on broadband connectivity will have as much impact as a discussion on monopoly meat processing markets did last fall. And again, I congratulate the Oklahoma Rural and Small Town Table of Common Interest for putting this on. Thank you for having me join you this evening.
Thank you, Governor. We appreciate that, and thank you for bringing those words, helping us kick off our event this evening. Governor Walters talked a little bit about the importance of Communications. Kim Groner, the Vice President of Pioneer Telephone Cooperative out of Kingfisher, Oklahoma, an organization that's been a leader in rural broadband, not just in the state of Oklahoma, but throughout the country. A little bit about some of the work they've done, seeing from about some of the in the hurdles that we're at the state of Oklahoma. With that, Kim, I want to turn the podium over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, good evening, and I'd like to thank Clay for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to be here and speak with you this evening. Like Clay said, I'm the Vice President of Pioneer Telephone Cooperative, and I'm going to share with you just a few brief slides. We'll talk about the history of Pioneer, our fiber optic deployment strategy, the technology that we're deploying. As Clay mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges from a service provider perspective. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the pandemic reaction that we had and some of the exposures that we saw that the pandemic was really good about pointing out to us. So who we are, Pioneer is a cooperative in the state of Oklahoma. We were established in 1953, serving 4 exchanges. At that time, we provided dial tone telephone service, old plain old telephone service to rural customers. And throughout the years, we have grown from 1953 from serving 4 rural exchanges to 76. From the beginning, we used copper plant to deploy our dial tone services. And we provided that service in a very reliable manner. Eventually, based on technological advances, we were able to add additional services such as internet. You'll all remember the initial internet deployment was dial-up service, and then it has evolved into subscriber line services or digital subscriber line services, DSL. And finally, in a fiber deployment, we're considering GPON. But that copper plant has served us very well since our inception. We've always used fiber in our networks, primarily for our backbone and transport perspective. We used fiber, if you think about it, to connect all of our exchanges, but the plant that was serving the customer was a copper plant. As the demand for broadband has grown over the years, Pioneer has advanced our deployments and strictly currently deploy a fiber-only plant in our networks. Several years ago, we began with what we call greenfield deployments in new housing additions or new areas of industry that needed connectivity for even just for dial tone. We started deploying fiber several years ago. And then since 2017 has been our real big push for fiber-only deployments in all areas. Today, Pioneer has fiber projects in progress in about 34 of our 76 exchanges. And currently that work in progress exceeds $110 million in investment and commitment to our subscribers and members in those areas. At the end of our planned deployments, we expect that total investment will exceed $400 million. Our strategy for fiber optics deployment, we currently have 6,187 miles of fiber deployed, and our miles of fiber under construction right now are about 3,100 miles of fiber. We do participate in the Alternative Connect America Cost Model, or ACAM program. It is a federal program that was designed, and Pioneer opted into that program in 2018. Our obligation in exchange for federal dollars is to serve 18,953 subscribers that were identified by the FCC as either unserved or underserved consumers in our territory. ACAM went through a couple of revisions, and today it is a 12-year program that will provide Pioneer just over $284 million to help us extend fiber services into rural customers in our cooperative footprint. We've also taken the initiative and commitment to build fiber to our city or our communities of interest in our exchange areas. ACAM identified specific rural customers based on census blocks, and those were identified by the FCC, and it didn't come near to providing service to all of our customers, even in the rural markets, but it certainly left our towns, our small rural towns, without fiber. And so Pioneer has committed to our city or town overbuilds, and we are making that commitment by using general funds. We've also, last year during the pandemic, applied for and was awarded a federal grant through the CARES Act in the amount of just over $24 million. And this is a program that is administered by the USDA. And Pioneer's commitment in order to receive those grant funds is an additional $8 million and some change. And it will provide, this particular project will provide service to rural customers in 4 counties that extends our reach beyond the ACAM footprint. And finally, our additional strategy with regard to fiber deployment is what we call a CLEC strategy. It is a competitive local exchange strategy where we are deploying fiber and overbuilding competition in larger areas than typically what Pioneer serves. We currently have 2 areas or 2 communities where Pioneer is currently under construction, and we have 1 other area where we are in the engineering plant and design area, or phase, pardon me. This is a map of our current service area, and this may be hard to see, but the gray areas indicate the Pioneer Telephone Cooperative footprint. And those are the exchanges that we serve. And you can see that our footprint is primarily Western Oklahoma, west of I-35, and we serve customers to the panhandle of Oklahoma. The blue lines represent the fiber that we have deployed. The little red dots are those retail locations that our cellular company have retail locations in, and the black stars represent our Pioneer Telephone retail locations in those communities where we serve. Another map, real quickly, is to show you the projects that are currently underway. The different colors represent the stages of those projects. I just might point out that the fuchsia or the hot pink color is the ACAM areas for future deployment. And those census blocks, this is a good representation to indicate that the census blocks that the FCC identified for us do not cover that entire exchange. So there are small blocks of people within our ACAM areas that are going to get fiber and the rest funding through that program. When we talk about technology, Pioneer is deploying a fiber to the home strategy with a GPON network. This type of deployment is capable of providing symmetrical gigabit speeds to the customer location. Our local internet traffic is aggregated on our Pioneer Core network to provide both a reliable and a redundant service or backhaul to the internet. We have multiple 100 gig paths to the internet, and we have multiple peering arrangements with major content providers such as Netflix, Facebook, and Google. If you're not familiar with the benefit of those peering arrangements, what it does is it enables Pioneer to have relationships with these content providers and put those peering computers within our network so that our consumers have a more reliable and robust connection to that content that they are pulling from the internet. So we bring the internet within our network a little bit, if that makes sense. We utilize both buried drops to the customer premise and aerial drops, depending on the location. Primarily in the most rural application, we bury drops from the main line of construction into the customer home. Other times in the more rural, in the communities rather, we usually will utilize more aerial drops. We also use a customer premise equipment or CPE installed in the home. Our standardized version right now is the Calyx GigaSpire with Wi-Fi 6 capabilities and mesh opportunities that helps us provide what we believe is the best Wi-Fi experience in the industry. So the benefits of fiber, we believe fiber is the future-proof technology. There's a lot of flavors of broadband connectivity out there, and Pioneer has provided them. So we are very well aware of some of those different types of technology. However, we believe fiber brings faster internet speeds up to 1 gigabyte or 1,000 megabytes of symmetrical upload and download stream. Consumers can connect multiple devices to the internet without sacrificing any speed. These connections include streaming movies, TV shows, music on multiple devices with no buffering interruptions. Online gamers are able to boost their experience by reducing lag time. We believe fiber is the newest technology and the highest quality with the most reliable connection. A recent national survey released their finding that stated home values in a fiber neighborhood had increased appraisal values when compared to similar neighborhoods with other broadband connection technologies. We believe fiber, at least for us, provides a redundant network, ensuring that there is network availability in the case of path failures. The challenges, there are many. I'd like to first address cost and access. Like I mentioned, we have 34 projects underway. The average cost to deploy fiber right now across those projects is $35,000 a mile. The number of locations that we can serve per mile varies greatly. We have projects that we serve 1 or 2 customers per mile, and we have projects that we can serve 60 or more customers per mile. So although fiber is the most reliable, it's the future-proof type of technology, it is also the most costly to deploy. Another challenge we see as a service provider is affordability for consumers. And even though consumers oftentimes have access to broadband connectivity, they're unable to afford the monthly service. And as a result of that, the federal government has had a low-income program called Lifeline. It's been available for many, many years that consumers with certain eligible requirements can apply for Lifeline. And because Pioneer participates in that program, we can provide those credits or those discounts immediately on the consumer's bill so that they only have to pay the net of their service minus those discounts. And recently, as a result of the pandemic, in fact, on May 12th, the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, or EBB as it's known in the industry, was launched. It's a temporary program. $3.2 billion was allocated to this program that provides, again, consumers with affordability issues an additional discount on top of any discounts that they may already be eligible for. So even the EBB can provide an additional discount over a lifeline discount if those consumers meet certain eligibility requirements. The EBB requirements are a bit more expanded a little bit further than a lifeline. There are additional 2 or 3 types of requirements that can be met and the consumers still be eligible for EBB. And the final challenge that we see as a service provider is the adoption rate. What we see is that as a service provider, we make a commitment to a community or to customers to deploy fiber at a cost of over $35,000 per mile, and then we see low or slow adoption rates of those consumers that we pass. What that does for us is it provides a significant burden on our ability to recover on our investment because we are continuing to provide service over the old copper plant. It increases our cost to maintain because now we have duplicate plant in the ground. We cannot retire the copper plant if we're still serving customers, but some customers, either through affordability, education, communication, whatever the multitude of reasons are, we are seeing some slow adoption rates even when they have access to broadband. So I think that, there is definitely a low rate with regard to the number of customers in Oklahoma that have subscriptions to broadband, but that doesn't always mean that the broadband is not available for them to subscribe to. In some areas, it means there's an affordability issue or there's an adoption issue where they're just not educated enough to take that next step to go into fiber or even understand how the internet can be utilized. So our reaction during the pandemic, in the middle of March, when the pandemic really kicked off strong, the FCC Chairman Pai, issued a Keep Americans Connected pledge and encouraged all service providers to join that pledge. Pioneer joined immediately, and by joining the Keep Americans Connected pledge, we agreed that we would suspend all disconnects of any service, telephone, internet, cellular, whatever it was, due to a consumer's inability to pay. We also agreed to waive all late fee charges or penalties, and we agreed to open our Wi-Fi hotspots that are typically used inside our retail locations. We opened them up as a guest network that could be connected by someone pulling into our parking lot and connecting a Wi-Fi connection using our Wi-Fi hotspot or our Wi-Fi hotspots. We also immediately launched a promotion of free service. The promotion also included no installation charges and no commitment for our broadband consumers. And we felt this was important because we were seeing that impact of the pandemic with the need for consumers to have connectivity, but so many without. We launched a promotion, that allowed them to connect basically without any cost restriction or penalty for service commitments or time with us. And in addition, we provided them free service for a certain amount of time. Before school started in August, we also launched a cellular hotspot or MiFi plan. We launched it that was specifically related to a school activation. It was $20 per month, and we passed through the MiFi units at our cost to the schools. And what we saw was the schools would activate these MiFi units and assign them to certain students who either did not have access to broadband or could not afford broadband, and they needed to participate in their distance learning programs. So we launched that. We had over 500 lines activated during the pandemic. We still have 300 of those lines active today. Pioneer also saw an increase in our unpaid balances of 123%. So our charge-offs, our uncollectible accounts increased dramatically during the pandemic. We attempted everything we could and entered into 1,800 payment arrangements to help those consumers extend their payment obligations over longer periods of time than what is normally accepted. So I do feel strongly that Pioneer did our part to react in a positive manner and try to do what we could during the pandemic timeframe. And just to summarize where I'm at, from a service provider, broadband connectivity perspective, we see that how the internet is utilized today just continues to change. You know, we see consumers using the internet for everything, including safety, cameras in their home, Ring doorbells, education from a distance learning perspective, work from home, entertainment, streaming TV, gaming, and the whole gamut of entertainment, convenience and communication. So many people are using the internet to, particularly through the pandemic, to keep in contact with loved ones through FaceTime or other types of applications that enable that communication. So the way we utilize the internet continues to change. Just last month, our broadband customers consumed an average of 500 gigabytes of broadband consumption per location. And we see that that consumption just continues to increase. The technology and the ability to advance technology, particularly with regard to the number and the types of devices that are connected in the home, that continues to drive the need for additional bandwidth. Would you ever have thought 5 years ago that you'd have light bulbs that are connected to the internet? I, for one, would not have expected that, but it's a reality. And so that consumption just continues to increase based on the types of devices that are becoming available to our consumers. And I'd like to wrap up with the statement that Pioneer believes that our rural communities expect and deserve the same quality of service that metro-like communities have available to them. And I believe and I hope that I have convinced you that Pioneer is doing our part to keep customers connected, not only through the pandemic, but in the future. And that's all I have. I'll leave my slide up with my contact information, but I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to visiting with everyone later. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you very much. Kim talked a little bit about some of the uses of technology and the importance of broadband throughout the state of Oklahoma. And one of the things that was brought up was the impact of connectivity on education. and to talk a little bit about the challenges and some of the opportunities and some of the hurdles that we've seen as far as connecting schools to broadband and the role that broadband plays in education. We have with us tonight Erica Wright, who is with the Oklahoma Rural Schools Coalition, to talk a little bit about broadband and its impact on education. With that, Erica, I'm going to turn the podium over to you.
Okay, I'm having problems getting a cursor. Okay. There we go. Close hers. Okay. I'll set this over here so I don't knock it off. Okay, hello, my name is Erica Wright, and I am here tonight to represent the Oklahoma Rural Schools Coalition. We are a grassroots network of public school advocates, particularly obviously for rural schools here in the state of Oklahoma. We have an online group with Facebook of about 6,000 members that are parents and educators, administrators, community leaders, business leaders, anybody and everybody who's interested in keeping up with rural school issues in the state of Oklahoma. I am from the community of Noble. I serve on the Public Schools Foundation there as president and also serve as a trustee for the Oklahoma Foundation of Excellence. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about and some of the statistics that I have are a little bit repetitive. We've heard Governor Walters address those. Kim brought some of those up in her presentation. But, you know, when you're talking about the need just in general in rural Oklahoma, I kind of split this up into 4 different buckets. The first one being disparity. And Governor Walters mentioned a quote, I believe it was from the Tulsa World, mentioning that the internet is no longer a luxury item. And especially in the world of education and learning, we've seen through the pandemic that this really needs to become less of a luxury item and more of a household utility per se. The issues that we're having with rural broadband access are really equal to that of the electrical and phone service in the 1930s. And so in order to keep our rural students in particular competitive in today's marketplace as they move on into the workforce, we've got to be able to bring them equal access to internet. So speaking of access, that's the next bucket. So only 48% of rural Oklahomans have access to broadband connection versus 74% nationally. And in some Oklahoma counties, that number is more than 75% according to the FCC. We also are dealing with income limitations. I know Kim mentioned that as well. 40% of Oklahoma households earning less than $20,000 have no internet connection, including smartphones. That shrinks to 6% for households earning more than $75,000 a year. And we know that rural Oklahoma has a disproportionately high rate of poverty in families with kids in schools. So it's not uncommon in our work when working with rural schools and looking at, one of the big markers for determining the poverty rate in a community is how many kids are enrolled in the free and reduced lunch program. And in my experience, it's not uncommon, especially in some of our more rural areas, to see that some of our school districts are dealing with 80 to 90% of their students that qualify for free reduced lunch. So income limitations for personal accessibility to the internet and to quality internet that's fast enough for them to be able to do distance learning and access programs online is a real issue. Speaking of quality, a little over 650,000 Oklahomans have no access to speeds that are outlined by the federal standards to run streaming services. In fact, there was a 2018 report that I believe the Governor Walters mentioned that ranks Oklahoma 47th out of 50 states for speed and connected homes. So obviously that played out big time this year when we got hit with the COVID-19 pandemic, and it put a glaring spotlight on the issues that we have with rural broadband connectivity in Oklahoma as it relates to students and schools. So here you can kind of see a nice visual map of the internet availability in Oklahoma. And you can see that some of our counties, greater than 75% of the families are without the needed resources that they need to have to be able to connect well. So a couple of things about rural schools in particular that some of you out there may not be aware of. So 90% of the public school districts in the state of Oklahoma are considered rural in part or in whole. So for example, I'm with Noble Public Schools. We are 15 minutes away from a major university here, from the University of Oklahoma. And yet my home, my MiFi through Verizon doesn't even work. So not all schools are completely out in the panhandle or totally rural, but some schools like Noble are considered more of in a suburban area. They're close to Norman, but yet we still have a lot of students that are in rural areas within our district boundaries that we're serving. So 90% of the schools in the state would fall into that partial or full rural tag onto them. So 56% of the K-12 students in the state of Oklahoma are enrolled in these districts. And we know, like I mentioned earlier, that higher rates of poverty and low-income students, that we have higher rates of poverty and low-income students in the rural areas of our state. So when we look at those 4 buckets that I mentioned earlier, and we kind of dial that down to an education standpoint, here's kind of some of the things that we saw played out, particularly this year with the COVID-19 pandemic. So from a disparity standpoint, only 1 in 4 Oklahoma students, according to the State Department of Education, only 1 in 4 of our students, 1 in 4 of our students has zero internet connectivity within their home. That means either they don't have access to it at all, maybe they can't afford it. There's a lot of different reasons that Kim covered earlier in her presentation. Only 52% of our Oklahoma school districts meet the minimum technology standards set forth by the State Department of Education, and that includes strong broadband connections. So we've got a lot of kiddos too many kiddos without connectivity in their homes, and our schools are not up to date with the services and the quality of services that they need to be able to provide the services that the current times demand. Access. So for many students, access to a reliable signal doesn't even exist. Like I said, I live 15 minutes east of Norman. Now we actually do have, through our internet provider, we have fiber now. We just got it about a month and a half ago, and it's awesome. But prior to that, for my own children during distance learning, when we use the MiFi hotspot through Verizon, it doesn't work where we are because we don't have a Verizon signal. So a lot of your kids don't even have a signal to access. Additionally, you've got the issue of access to just the basic equipment. So say they do have internet, but a lot of our kiddos are not running around with laptops and desktops. They don't have the basic hardware that they need to be able to study and do their distance learning. Now, I know a lot of schools have really worked hard to be able to get Chromebooks. I know our school district, it was really tough to find Chromebooks when all of this started, right? Because everybody was looking for Chromebooks for their kids. So that's another issue, is that we've got a lot of kids in rural Oklahoma with these districts that don't have access to the hardware that they need to do distance learning. So you take all of that and you combine it with the lack of textbooks, right? So our kids don't even have textbooks that are up to date in some of our schools. And so now all of a sudden you throw that all together in this horrible situation with COVID-19, and in our rural areas, the disparity that we found versus our peers in suburban and urban areas is that you've got kiddos that all of their learning, really, even prior to the pandemic, is taking place in the classroom, right? Because once they leave, they don't have an internet or a laptop to be able to research for that science fair project. They don't have a textbook that's up to date to be able to help them to do their homework. A lot of our communities don't have public libraries where they can even go and do that. And so you had an issue even prior to this pandemic where a lot of our rural kids don't have the resources they need to learn outside of the classroom. And this inhibits their learning and exploration opportunities when you compare that to what their peers have at the same level in urban and suburban settings. And then also the income limitations. So the cost of connection is higher than our high-risk populations can afford. So somebody mentioned there is and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, there's a rural broadband group up at the Capitol that's been meeting about these issues. And one of the Senate leaders for that is Senator Lee Wright out of Bristow. And he mentioned in one of those meetings that in the beginning of the pandemic, he was paying $600 a month to have enough for his own Wi-Fi or his own hotspots and boosters to be able to have his 4 kids be able to efficiently access their distance learning. So obviously $600 a month is not something that the average Oklahoman is able to afford. A lot of our patrons and families in our school district, they can't even afford the basic cost of connectivity, much less something like that if it's not available. And then quality. So obviously we learned with distance learning. I mean, prior to the pandemic, you had the issue of not being able to connect to do research for projects, but then you move into the COVID-19 pandemic, and now we've got kids that are expected to do distance learning, but if they do have access and they are able to afford it, the speeds weren't quick enough for them to be able to actually access some of the Zoom classes and the online distance learning issues. And, you know, if you look at that from a perspective, if you've got a kiddo, say in Batiste, Oklahoma, who needs to log in to do his homework, the same kid in Norman would log in to do that homework assignment. It'd take him about 20 minutes. But you throw that assignment to a kid in Batiste who doesn't have the speed of their internet, it takes, you know, a couple of hours sometimes to get some of this stuff knocked out. And you've got kids that are living with grandparents and parents who aren't really internet savvy and things tech savvy. So it just really created a pile on to a lot of these families because it just took so long. Now, a lot of our rural schools didn't do the distance learning in the same way that you would see OKC and TPS. A lot of our rural schools actually went back to school in the fall and have been in school this whole year and did not have to rely on the distance learning that you saw in other areas. And part of that is because they didn't have the ability to successfully do it with their kids because of all of these things that we mentioned. And so, you know, that is a real issue that they had to make a choice. Are we going to bring our kids back to school and take the risk with the virus? They had to make some choices that were very difficult choices to make. So the impact of this lack of internet connectivity in rural schools. You know, as a former school board member, I know that school board members and administrators all across the state, their focus is creating an education for children that will enter the workforce in 15 years for jobs that we don't even know exist right now, right? And we know that the workforce of the future is going to demand that we have students and children moving into that workforce that are educated in STEM, in technology, and they are literate and able to function in a workforce that centers around technology. So 45% of high schools nationwide teach computer science in their classrooms. Here in Oklahoma, that number is about 29%. That's not good enough. We're failing our students when we don't give them the opportunity to have the education to enter into the workforce with technology behind them. Oklahoma currently only meets 4 of the 9 computer science education recommendations by the U.S. Department of Education. So how do we get that to be improved? I know there was some legislation this session that went through looking at mandating some more computer science classes within classrooms, but ultimately that didn't even make it out of committee. I'm not sure why, but I would guess in my head that it's very difficult to mandate computer science courses when your kids don't have access to the internet, right? They can't do their computer science homework if they can't access it. So additionally, here's some of the other impacts that we've seen with the lack of internet connectivity in our rural schools, students are limited in the advanced online course offerings that they can get access to. You know, if you are in wherever Oklahoma, let's say Godibo, Oklahoma, and you want to access some advanced placement courses, well, with the internet, that opens up a world of things that you can take, right? You may not have a Japanese teacher, but you can access a Japanese advanced placement course online, or it could be engineering or whatever, right? So without access to the internet that's solid and streamable, our kids don't have access in rural areas to the advanced placement courses that they would have online in other areas. They're also less able to access, obviously, the quality online distance learning. We spoke about that. They're less likely to participate in concurrent college enrollment. Most of our universities and colleges around the state have concurrent enrollment courses for high school students to be able to gain college credit. And without the ability for kids to be able to access that off of school hours with a good, strong internet connectivity, they're not able to do that. Also, there's a lot of programs that have developed in this internet age where kids can access or school districts can access medical care for children via the internet through virtual medical services and mental health services. And we've seen here through the pandemic that mental health care with our kids is a very, very important thing, that a lot of our schools, being underfunded, aren't able to have enough mental health care professionals there for their kids. So one of the beauties of the internet is that you can access mental health care providers from the more populated areas of the state and bring them to work with your kids and with your teachers. But without the internet access in these areas, that makes it more difficult. So our students are struggling to compete in a technology-heavy job market without the resources that they need. And until the state does something about boosting that up, we're going to see our Oklahoma rural students fall further and further behind their peers in more populated areas as they enter the workforce. And our rural teachers have also been negatively impacted as well. You know, I heard from several teachers that live in areas where they didn't have the ability to work from home like they needed because they couldn't get online as well with the speeds that they needed. And then all of a sudden, the cost of running more information through was hiking up their own personal internet bills. So I know Kim mentioned, so when we talk about solutions, some of the things that we have seen is what Kim was talking about, where you have businesses that are opening up public hotspots. I know in Tahlequah, they did a partnership with one of their local service providers to provide some free public hotspots. I know a lot of our rural schools attempted to do rural bus setup, so they would put a hotspot on a bus and go deploy that bus to a parking lot someplace, within the district boundaries, so that families could drive and be able to park next to that bus and access the internet. So there was some creativity involved in the beginning, but what we found from an education standpoint is that's not really a sustainable long-term solution. It's something people kind of pieced together in the beginning. I mean, I think we would all agree that hanging out in the parking lot next to a bus in your mom and dad's car is not exactly the most effective learning environment for a child. Or if you have a kid who mom and dad doesn't have a car and they're going to walk up there and hang out in the parking lot, there's obviously safety issues and security issues for the bus and the equipment as well. So there is a community by the name of Warner down, I believe they're southeast of Muskogee. They have about 800 students. They partnered with a local service provider. At the beginning of the pandemic, they only had 50% of their families that had access to internet in the home. I think that's a pretty, from what I have had feedback from rural school districts, that's pretty common. We see about 50%, sometimes less, sometimes a little bit between the 40 and 60% range. So they partnered with Cost Telephone to connect an additional 200 households at no cost for the installation and the equipment that they needed. And they were able to bring up their digital learning to 95% in that district. I have a video, but we're going to pass through that because I don't know how to play that. So that was a win. That was a win with some partnership where they weren't relying on what is the legislature going to figure out how to fix this in the long term. They're working closely with their businesses there in their community to find a solution. And it worked for that community. Oh, look, it is playing, but it's not playing. So we'll move on. Okay, so what is the Oklahoma Department of Education doing to help improve this for school districts in the state of Oklahoma? So in 2016, under Governor Fallin, there was an initiative launched called the Oklahoma Connect and Learn Initiative, which was a personalized learning plan for advanced courses and concurrent enrollment. This program, this initiative, was a voluntary opportunity for school districts to participate in so that they could maximize that broadband access at the district level. So that was already in place. I have not been able to find any published reports of where we are with that. There was just kind of some information that it's there, but I'm not really sure what the outcomes for that are as far as numbers of participation. I'm sure those who didn't participate sure as heck wish they had have before the pandemic hit. So the Oklahoma State Department of Education on their website does have a pretty comprehensive list of internet connection resources available for families. In July of 2020, the State Department of Education awarded through a grant process to 175 districts around the state, which is about a third of the districts in the state, were able to get 50,000 jetpacks and unlimited 4G data plans. In this competitive grant process, using a portion of the federal funds that were released for COVID through the CARES money and ESSER. And then OneNet, I know Governor Walters mentioned that earlier. OneNet had a no-cost content filtering and tech support for districts that were awarded the grants that the State Department sent out. So they absorbed the $250,000 cost of that program. As far as legislative efforts, there is the Rural Broadband Expansion Council that was formed through the Oklahoma legislature to improve and expand and reduce the cost of high-speed internet connectivity in rural Oklahoma. That is led by Representative Logan Phillips out of Mounds and Senator James Lee Wright out of Bristow, and several stakeholders in the game. So your service providers, healthcare, business, municipal stakeholders. Unfortunately, from the list that I've seen of who's participating, they didn't pull anybody in from the education world, which is unfortunate, but it's the reality. But you do have a lot of really smart people in the room that are trying to work on this for the past 9 months to create this broadband expansion package. Here's some of the things. So I spoke with Representative Phillips before I came to kind of get bullet points of some of the things they're trying to do. I know that the Governor Walters mentioned that they have passed some legislation this week. I've been kind of unplugged this week. So our group with the Oklahoma Rural Schools Coalition will be really diving into this issue over the summer with our people, because that was definitely a big need that was identified back in the fall when we polled our members of what was important to them. It was internet connectivity. But Representative Phillips shared with me, these are some of the things that they're working on. They've redefined the state statutes to align to the federal statutes in order to capture the $7.4 billion of federal broadband money that's available. They're also working on building a grant program to align state money and federal money for building specifically into the unserved and underserved areas. And mentioned earlier, they created a tax incentive rebate, which was a $20 million cap for 3 years to companies willing to build into those unserved and underserved areas. And I believe Governor Walters mentioned that 3/4 of that, I believe, is earmarked for rural areas. They're expanding the Broadband Council to include the tribes and a few more people to pull into that. They're partnering with the Department of Transportation and Railways to lay conduit and create a statewide internet pathway. And they also clarified language for right-of-ways and pole attachments, allowing for companies a fairer connection to areas, which will result in expanded connections. So those were the goals, I believe, that were identified by that Broadband Council. And like I said, I'm not really sure where they are in achieving those goals, but those are the goals that they've laid out. So we're gonna kind of keep a close eye on that as we move through the summer and get out of this legislative session and see where we landed. Kim mentioned earlier the federal efforts, the Keep America Connected program. You can find, if you're interested in finding all of the companies that are participating in that, there is a list of that on the Oklahoma State Department of Education website. And she also mentioned the Broadband Assistance Program, which provides discounted internet service to families who need it that are low income or have suffered substantial loss in income since February of last year. And you do, I think you do get a little bit more of a discount if you live on tribal lands. So anyway, from an education standpoint, we all know after living through this pandemic that this is an important thing for education in our state to make up for the disparity in income limitations and access and quality. So please follow us on Facebook, Oklahoma Rural Schools Coalition, and we'll keep you informed as we move through the process on how this affects education. Thank you so much. That out.
Thank you, Erica.
You bet.
We've talked a little bit about government services, especially talking about education, but it's also extremely important that we talk about the impact that broadband can have on economic development and the quality of life. And joining us here this evening to talk a little bit about that from his perspective, from working in a small community in Northwest Oklahoma, we're honored to have with us James Leonard, who is the president of the Northwest Oklahoma Alliance. Mr. Leonard's going to come and talk to us a little bit about the economic development impact that broadband has on our rural communities. Mr. Leonard, I'll turn the microphone over to you.
I'm not sure what you're supposed to say when it's all already been said. I do want to reiterate a quote that we heard from Governor Walters. It seems perfect, I think, especially for this evening, in that broadband is not a luxury, it's an economic necessity. Broadband is so important, and everybody knows that the better internet service that we have, the better services, the better participation, the better successes we are able to provide and experience. To share with you this evening, I visited with a number of my fellow board members and colleagues and local businesses to get some specific comments, input, and examples to share with you. And the first two comments that I got right off the bat was internet drives business. No internet, no business. And the next was, frankly, if we didn't have high-speed access, this business would not be here. One small town that is fortunate to have fiber, this is pretty exciting, I think, but one small town that has fiber was telling me that they have enjoyed having several of their young people move back home to live because the internet access that they have there is just as good as they could have gotten somewhere else. And, you know, so many of our small towns, mine, for example, outmigration is a problem. And the idea that later fiber could come into the community and we may get to enjoy some of that, it's pretty exciting, I think. And I can tell you that recently our Northwest Oklahoma Alliance held a Zoom legislative reception, and the importance and need for broadband in rural Oklahoma came up over and over and over. During the shutdown, increased work brought city and college residents back home to my county, Harper County, but they experienced considerable issues with cellular internet coverage. Participating in Zoom classrooms proved problematic, and they didn't have the bandwidth they needed to up and download large volume files. So, as Pioneer mentioned earlier, we do need to have high quality internet in our rural areas, just like in the metropolitan areas. And now that we've learned that occupations can be fulfilled at home or from a distance, the smaller towns, again, could repopulate somewhat with the advent of broadband. One of my fellow board members, a progressive and entrepreneurial farmer, was telling me about the difficulties that he experiences with his farming operation. He does a lot of video conferencing referencing with, his fellow farmers and so forth. And they have a lot of trouble with buffering and interruptions and signal loss. He tries to expand his education in all things agriculture. And he said it's not rare at all for him to be dropped out of classrooms, to be logged out of testing. So it's pretty frustrating. Pioneer encourages us to go to their Go Pioneer site to register with an interest in fiber. It's non-committal, but they can look at that and see, what the interest level is in that area. Telemedicine, if you don't have fiber, it's just not viable. Broadband is so important for the medical community, hospitals, clinics, EMS. They're sending films to radiologists, accessing specialty care, electronic health records, and other services all require broadband capability. Most towns got to experience some of their young people returning home to continue their college courses. And again, that one town that has fiber, their students had a very positive experience. They continued right along with college. And as they were getting things done, they were also hiring on at places in the community. They were volunteering in the community. And then there were communities that don't have that ability. The students had a very different experience where they were unable to, again, due to buffering and interruptions and signal loss, they were just getting frustrated and spending a lot of time in front of the computer trying to take those courses. And so they didn't get to take as much part in their community. Remote work, remote education, and remote health care are all vitally important, and they're all made possible by broadband. All business and industry, no matter how small or large, needs broadband connectivity just for existence. We have to have high quality, reliable internet to operate existing businesses as well as growing opportunities for us in rural Oklahoma. I leave you with this: being without broadband is like being without water. If you need me to take up a little more time, I could spend several minutes buffering.
Mr. Leonard, thank you so much. You've heard several of our speakers talk a little bit about tonight. They've talked about some of the issues that have been brought up at the State House. Several have referenced sometime the similarity between broadband and rural electricity. And for those of you who know your history, know that the Rural Electrification Act and the REA was instrumental in getting electricity into the rural areas. And the agency now that has taken that actually has that mantle that's grew out from the REA is the Rural Utility Service. And our final speaker for this evening is a gentleman who's with that agency, Robert Mikado, the General Field Representative and Telecommunications Program for the Rural Utility Service and USDA Rural Development, is here to talk a little bit and build off of some of the comments that have been made about the investment that the federal government has been making in broadband throughout the country, especially here in Oklahoma, and talk a little bit about what's on the horizon, what they're trying to do, and some of the challenges and opportunities that they see. So with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to Mr. Mikado to give us a presentation.
So thank you all for for your interest in our programs. I know there's been folks that have spoken already about the necessity for broadband in rural Oklahoma. This is something we definitely agree with and want to promote in rural communities at the Rural Utility Service. Some of our legacy borrowers have been companies, rural incumbent local service providers who have been with us since that program that was previously mentioned, the Rural Electrification Act. They've been with us since the 1950s, and we definitely want to support rural communities. we do have a few programs that might apply to rural Oklahoma. Most notably is our Reconnect program. That's the big program that a lot of folks are interested in now. And please don't quote me on this. It's something above my pay grade, but we do anticipate the Reconnect program to be open for applications around September, give or take a month or so. If anyone is interested in presenting an application, I would welcome the opportunity to discuss with you, on an individual basis, the specifics of your application, because these applications are very intricate. There is a lot that goes into them, but in general, what we aim to serve are communities that have 90% or greater of the population that is unserved, and we're looking at households here. But 90% or greater of the households that are unserved by 25 megabits down or 3 up. Once again, I'd encourage folks to reach out to me individually if you have any questions on a prospective application. I'd love to work through that with you and discuss the details of any prospective application. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Mikado. Well, I believe that wraps up all of our speakers that we have for the presentation this evening. I do think we had an option to possibly ask some questions through the chat box at home. Do we have any questions that's come through on our feed for any of our presenters this evening? We don't have any questions. Are there any questions from anyone here for any of our presenters that we had tonight that joined us this evening?
I would ask Kim about, you're probably familiar with Dr. Scheidler that was at OSU. Well, he had shared at a conference that I was at, Pioneer had this public library hotspot.
Well, I just understood it wasn't available in Northwest Oklahoma. Is it only available in Southwest? Okay, I thought that was a Pioneer program. Okay. Okay.
Got off the ground.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Further questions? Seeing none, we thank you all for joining us this evening. We appreciate everyone who joined us at home. All the presentations that you see will also be available on YouTube through the site with the rural and small town table of common interests at our feed that we have on YouTube. We encourage you to inform your friends about that. We appreciate all of you taking time on this issue and stay focused. If you would pay attention in the media, there's going to be another one of these events that we're going to have later on this summer, early fall, talking on education. This will be the third of our informational outreach forums that we've had, talking about educational funding in Oklahoma and some of the challenges that we are seeing with our rural education system. With that, we appreciate all of you joining here this evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you to all of our presenters, and we hope you have a great evening. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.